Welcome to another journey through the stars, dear listener. If you enjoy these galactic tales that help you drift into peaceful slumber, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more cosmic adventures. As the eternal void of space stretches before us, a single Imperial Star Destroyer cuts through the darkness with silent precision. Within its command chamber stands a figure unlike any other in the Emperor's service. Blue skin contrasts sharply against the sterile white and grey of Imperial design. Grand Admiral Thrawn's glowing red eyes narrow slightly as they scan star charts projected before him, seeing patterns where others see only random celestial bodies. His long fingers trace connections invisible to the untrained eye, mapping a strategy that spans not merely battles or campaigns, but decades of careful positioning across the galaxy. Around him, Imperial officers move with quiet efficiency, their respect for this alien commander evident despite the Empire's human-centric prejudices. The future of the galaxy lies not in what is visible, Thrawn murmurs to himself, but in what remains hidden from ordinary view. His gaze shifts to a small artifact displayed in a secure case near his private terminal. The object appears insignificant to most who glimpse it, a fragment of carved stone from a world few have visited, bearing markings in a language only a handful in the galaxy can read. Yet this relic, from Thrawn's distant homeworld, carries secrets that would reshape understanding of both his past and the galaxy's future. As the Star Destroyer continues its silent journey through the void, Thrawn allows himself a rare moment of contemplation. His presence in Imperial service represents a paradox few have attempted to solve. How did a non-human rise to such prominence in Palpatine's xenophobic regime? And what greater purpose could drive such a calculating mind to pledge allegiance to an empire he studies with the same analytical precision he applies to his enemies? The mystery of Thrawn begins not with power, but with art, for in the creative expressions of civilizations he finds their vulnerabilities laid bare. And somewhere among the stars he now surveys lies a threat only he can see coming. A danger that makes the conflicts of the present seem like mere shadows of the true war to come. The coldness of deep space permeates the corridors of Imperial vessels, yet something about Thrawn's private chambers feels different. Here the temperature seems calibrated to match the homeworld of the Chiss, a subtle reminder of origins far beyond the charted territories of the Empire. The walls display not Imperial propaganda, but carefully preserved works of art from 100 worlds. Sculptures, paintings, textiles, each meticulously labeled with details of their creation and cultural significance. In the soft blue glow of holographic displays, Thrawn's quarters transform into a museum of galactic history told through creative expression. The air carries the faint scent of unfamiliar spices, another small concession to memories of a distant home among the stars of the unknown regions. Long before he wore the white uniform of a Grand Admiral, Thrawn was Mithril Nuruodo, a rising, tactical genius among the Chiss ascendancy. Their civilization thrived in isolation, developing technologies and strategies unknown to the Republic or later Empire. The architecture of Chiss worlds favored clean lines and soaring structures that seemed to capture starlight within their crystalline surfaces. Their military doctrine valued precision and foresight above overwhelming force, traits that would later define Thrawn's approach to Imperial warfare. When Thrawn first encountered humans, it was through the eyes of a military strategist assessing potential allies or threats. His initial Imperial contact came in the form of Ensign Eli Vanto, a young supply officer with a gift for languages who found himself unexpectedly assigned as translator to this enigmatic, blue-skinned prisoner discovered on a remote world. You speak basic with remarkable precision for someone claiming to be an exile, Vanto noted during their first conversations. I find that understanding the nuances of language reveals much about those who speak it, Thrawn replied, his glowing red eyes studying Vanto with unsettling intensity, just as understanding art reveals the soul of those who create it. Their relationship evolved from reluctant association to something approaching mutual respect. Vanto witnessed Thrawn's meteoric rise through Imperial ranks, a journey unprecedented for a non-human in Palpatine's regime. He observed as Thrawn's tactical brilliance transformed crushing defeats into impossible victories, all while collecting and studying the art of every civilization he encountered. Beyond the immediate circle of Imperial command, other figures would later play crucial roles in the Thrawn narrative. Captain Gilad Pellaeon, who would one day serve as his most trusted officer, the Jedi Ezra Bridger, whose path would cross with Thrawn's in ways neither could anticipate, and from his homeworld, Aristocra Aralani, whose knowledge of Thrawn's true purpose remained hidden from Imperial eyes. In the privacy of his meditation chamber aboard the Chimera, Thrawn sometimes engaged in the Chiss practice of sequential contemplation, a disciplined form of strategic thinking that examined problems from continuously shifting perspectives. Here, surrounded by the collected artistic achievements of countless civilizations, he would spend hours in perfect stillness, his mind traveling pathways invisible to others. Those who served under his command rarely saw these moments of quiet reflection. They knew only the composed, analytical commander whose tactical decisions seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they occurred. Only Vanto glimpsed the complexity beneath the carefully maintained exterior, the weight of knowledge. Thrawn carried about threats gathering beyond the galaxy's edge, far from the concerns of emperor or rebellion. "You study us as carefully as you study our enemies," Vanto once observed, during a rare moment of candor. "All knowledge has value," Thrawn replied, his attention seemingly focused on a delicate sculpture from Alderaan. "Understanding potential allies may prove as crucial as understanding confirmed adversaries." The statement contained layers of meaning that would take years to fully unravel. For while Thrawn served the Empire with apparent loyalty, his gaze remained fixed on distant horizons where dangers gathered that made the conflicts of the present seem insignificant by comparison. The journey to understand Thrawn begins with a contradiction. A tactical genius does not surrender to inferior forces. A strategist of his caliber does not allow himself to be exiled to a remote planet where Imperial scouts would inevitably find him. These apparent failures were perhaps the first moves, in a game played across decades and light years. "I accept the mission," Thrawn had told the Chiss leadership before his departure, though the exact nature of this assignment remained classified at the highest levels of the Ascendancy. Records suggest he left behind detailed analyses of threats gathering in the void between galaxies, civilizations with technologies and ambitions that could threaten both his people and the known galaxy. The star maps Thrawn studied in his private moments revealed anomalies invisible to standard Imperial scans. Regions where ships disappeared without trace, planets whose indigenous species vanished overnight, communications intercepted in languages unknown to the most comprehensive protocol droids. These disparate points formed a pattern recognizable only to someone trained in the analytical methods of the Chiss. Each discovery added weight to warnings Thrawn had delivered to his own people years before joining the Empire. The threats gathering beyond the edge of known space were patient, methodical, and utterly alien in their strategies. They studied civilizations for generations before striking, learning weaknesses, infiltrating slowly, and now their attention, had begun to shift toward both the Chiss ascendancy and the galaxy dominated by the Empire. In his quarters aboard the Chimera, Thrawn often paused before a particular artifact kept separate from his other collections. A small pyramidal device of unknown origin, its surface etched with symbols that predated recorded history in most civilizations. When activated by specific frequencies, the artifact projected stellar configurations unlike any in current astronomical records. "What do you see in this, Admiral?" Vanto asked him once, after watching Thrawn study the projection for hours. "Migration patterns," Thrawn replied. "Ancient journeys across the void fleeing something that pursued them from their homeworlds. The same patterns repeating across millennia, across species with no contact between them." The implication lingered unspoken between them. Whatever had driven those ancient civilizations to desperate flight might still exist, still hunt among the stars. And perhaps now its attention had turned toward more populated regions of the galaxy. Thrawn's hand moved almost unconsciously to his chest, where beneath his immaculate uniform he carried a data cylinder containing information too, sensitive to trust to Imperial networks, star charts, threat assessments, and strategies developed over years of careful study, all focused on enemies the Empire did not yet recognize. "The Emperor believes he understands power," Thrawn murmured, more to himself than his companion. "But true strategic advantage lies not in the force one wields, but in the knowledge of when and where to apply it." His gaze returned to the artifact, its ancient light casting strange shadows across his blue features. In that moment, his commitment crystallized into certainty. He would use the resources of the Empire to prepare for threats beyond its comprehension. He would gather knowledge, technology, and tactical experience that could one day serve in a greater conflict, and if necessary, he would sacrifice his reputation, his position, perhaps even his life in service to this greater purpose. The stars beyond the viewport seemed to dim slightly, as though acknowledging the weight of this decision. Somewhere out there, beyond the borders of charted space, eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall for millennia had taken notice of this corner of the galaxy. The true war was still distant, but its opening moves had already begun, and Thrawn, Exile, and Admiral would ensure that when the time came, the forces of order would not face this threat unprepared. The corridors of the Imperial Academy on Coruscant echoed with whispers as Thrawn moved through them. Human cadets stared with poorly concealed fascination at the blue-skinned alien in an instructor's uniform. His rapid ascension through Imperial ranks defied all precedent, generating equal measures of admiration and resentment, he predicted. Not just the enemy's military strategy, but their cultural response to defeat, one senior officer explained to a group of tactical students. Within 3 moves, he had transformed their victory celebration into a surrender ceremony. What these accounts often omitted was Thrawn's method. Before engaging the pirates threatening Imperial shipping lanes in the Outer Rim, he had spent weeks studying their cultural artifacts. Their ship decorations, the patterns of their attacks, even the music intercepted from their communications, all became pieces in the puzzle of their psychology. "Art is not merely decorative," Thrawn explained to his skeptical Imperial governor. "It is the expression of a civilization's deepest values and fears. Understand what a people create, and you understand how they think." This approach yielded victories where conventional Imperial tactics had failed. Where others saw only disorganized raiders, Thrawn recognized distinct cultural groupings with predictable responses to specific stimuli. Where Imperial commanders relied on overwhelming firepower, Thrawn deployed precisely calculated pressure points that collapsed enemy resistance with minimal casualties on either side. Each success elevated his position, granting access to increasingly classified information about Imperial operations across the galaxy. Access he used not only to fulfill his immediate duties, but to search for connections to the threats he knew were gathering beyond Imperial space. In his private research, disturbing patterns emerged. Ancient star temples on scattered worlds shared architectural elements despite no known contact between their builders. Myths from 100 different species described similar invaders from beyond known space, arriving in ships that seemed to bend reality around them. Archaeological sites across the Outer Rim showed evidence of advanced civilizations that disappeared overnight, leaving behind only cryptic warnings. Eli Vanto, now promoted alongside Thrawn due to their continued association, found the Admiral late one cycle examining holographic projections of these disparate findings. "You believe these are connected?" Vanto observed. "Not a question, but a realization." "They are fragments of a larger pattern," Thrawn confirmed. "Consider how many civilizations have risen and fallen across the history of this galaxy. Now consider what might cause advanced societies to vanish so completely that only archaeological traces remain." "Natural disasters? Civil wars?" Vanto suggested, "simultaneously across multiple star systems, with no attempt to rebuild or reconnect with colony worlds?" Thrawn's glowing eyes narrowed slightly. "Something systematic, something patient, something that studies its prey before striking." This private investigation continued parallel to Thrawn's official rise through Imperial command. As his reputation for tactical brilliance grew, so too did his access to resources that could be quietly directed toward preparation for threats beyond Imperial understanding. His first major victory as commander of the Imperial Star Destroyer, Chimera demonstrated both his unconventional methods and his growing power within the Imperial hierarchy. Facing a rebel fleet that had successfully evaded 3 previous Imperial task forces, Thrawn deployed his forces in a formation that initially appeared to leave critical vulnerabilities. The rebels, sensing opportunity, committed their full strength to what seemed an obvious weakness in the Imperial line. Only too late did they realize Thrawn had studied not just their tactics, but the personal history of their commander, a former mining guild overseer whose operational patterns reflected early training in resource extraction. The rebel ships found themselves caught in a precisely calculated trap, with escape routes blocked by interdictors positioned based on Thrawn's analysis of their commander's psychological tendencies. The victory was absolute, the rebel fleet destroyed, Thrawn's position secured. Yet in the quiet of his chambers afterward, reviewing the data gathered during the engagement, his expression remained troubled. The resources expended, the ships and technologies lost, all assets that might one day be needed against a far greater threat. In his encoded personal log, accessible only through CHIS authentication protocols, Thrawn added a single entry that night. Imperial strategic doctrine continues to prioritize visible enemies over emerging threats. Time remains my scarcest resource. Imperial intelligence reports classified Grand Admiral Thrawn with clinical precision, a tactical genius whose loyalty to the Empire had been secured through recognition of his abilities and elevation to ranks, normally closed to non-humans. The conclusion seemed self-evident. An exile from his own people had found opportunity within Imperial service. His ambition was satisfied through the power he wielded commanding the 7th Fleet. His tactical innovations served Imperial dominance and, by extension, galactic order. This narrative satisfied most who encountered it. Emperor Palpatine himself appeared to endorse this understanding, granting Thrawn unprecedented authority for military operations across multiple sectors. High-ranking officers who might otherwise have objected to serving under an alien found themselves unable to argue with his consistent results. The Emperor rewards effectiveness. became the explanation for Thrawn's continued rise. Results matter more than origin. Even among rebels and those who opposed imperial rule, this interpretation gained credence. Thrawn represented the Empire's pragmatism, its willingness to use any asset, even one that contradicted its human-centric ideology, in pursuit of greater control. Yet beneath this accepted understanding, discrepancies emerged for those close enough to observe them. Eli Vanto, now serving as Thrawn's aide with the rank of lieutenant commander, noticed patterns that contradicted the opportunistic exile narrative. During routine data transmissions to Imperial Center, Vanto observed Thrawn sending encrypted packets through secondary channels. The transmissions were brief, disguised within standard operational updates, and directed toward coordinates that corresponded to no known Imperial facility. When stellar calculations were applied, these coordinates led beyond the outer rim into regions of space officially unexplored by the Empire. More troubling were the resources Thrawn occasionally diverted without clear strategic justification. Advanced sensor arrays deployed to monitor seemingly empty regions of space, research priorities assigned to technologies with limited immediate tactical application but significant potential for long-range detection and defense, detailed analyses of ancient xenotechnological artifacts that Imperial archaeologists had dismissed as ceremonial rather than functional. Admiral, Vanto ventured during a private briefing, these resource allocations will be difficult to justify in the quarterly command review. Thrawn regarded him with that characteristic, unreadable expression, red eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. The justifications exist, Commander Vanto, though they cannot be included in standard Imperial reports. Some knowledge is dangerous not because it should remain secret, but because revealing it prematurely would prevent proper preparation. Vanto studied the star chart displayed between them, noting the subtle emphasis Thrawn had placed on regions, far from active rebel activity or known criminal operations. "You believe there's something out there," Vanto stated quietly. "Something worse than the rebellion." Thrawn's silence provided its own answer. Finally, he deactivated the star chart and moved to a viewport that faced the galactic rim. The Empire and Rebellion focus on their civil war as though it represents the greatest threat to galactic stability. They fight over political systems and distribution of power while ignoring histories written in the ruins of civilizations far older than either Republic or Empire. For a brief moment, something like genuine emotion crossed Thrawn's features, a concern deeper than tactical calculation. "My service to the Empire is genuine, Commander. Order must be maintained. Chaos benefits no one, particularly in the face of what lies beyond our borders. But this conflict between rebels and Imperials may prove merely a prelude to a far greater challenge, one that will require resources and unity currently being squandered in internal disputes." The encounter left Vanto disturbed, re-evaluating years of observations in light of this new perspective. If Thrawn truly served neither ambition nor Imperial doctrine, but some greater purpose connected to threats beyond known space, then every victory, every tactical innovation, every resource acquisition served a dual purpose invisible to both the Empire he served and the rebels he fought. The narrative of the opportunistic exile crumbled under this new interpretation. In its place emerged something far more complex, a strategic genius playing a multi-dimensional game across decades, using the most powerful military force in the galaxy as both shield and weapon against enemies it did not know existed. The simplicity of ambition gave way to the complexity of purpose, and somewhere beyond the stars visible from Imperial vessels, the threats Thrawn prepared to face continued their patient observation, their methodical advance, their quiet infiltration of a galaxy distracted by its own internal conflicts. The deeper one ventures into understanding Thrawn, the more complex the patterns become. His campaigns against rebel forces across the Outer Rim revealed a methodical mind that saw connections invisible to others. Where Imperial doctrine favored overwhelming force applied directly, Thrawn constructed elaborate strategic webs that seemed to anticipate not just enemy movements, but their psychological responses. On Lothal, his systematic dismantling of rebel operations demonstrated this approach in its most refined form. Rather than the typical Imperial bombardment that might drive sympathizers to the rebel cause, Thrawn implemented gradual pressure that isolated rebel cells from their support networks. He studied local art traditions, recognizing cultural signatures that identified likely rebel sympathizers. He analyzed economic patterns to predict supply movements. Most importantly, he approached the conflict not as a simple military problem, but as a challenge requiring cultural, economic, and psychological dimensions. "You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand," he explained to Governor Price during tactical briefings. "An understanding requires more than knowledge of their weapons and numbers. It requires comprehension of their values, their priorities, their ways of perceiving the universe itself." This holistic approach extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. In his private research quarters aboard the Chimera, Thrawn maintained an extensive collection of artifacts gathered from the edges of known space. Star charts with anomalous readings, unconventional metal alloys recovered from ancient shipwrecks, most notably a growing archive of artistic and cultural fragments from civilizations that had experienced sudden, unexplained collapse. These private studies occupied hours that other officers might have devoted to leisure or political advancement. Thrawn would spend entire duty cycles comparing archaeological findings from scattered worlds, seeking patterns that might explain their simultaneous abandonment millennia ago. He compiled reports on unexplained disappearances of scientific outposts along the galactic rim. He authorized deep space probes directed toward regions with no apparent strategic value to current Imperial operations. During one such research session, interrupted by a tactical alert, Captain Gilad Pellaeon observed something unusual. As Thrawn responded to reports of rebel activity, his terminal briefly displayed star charts focused on regions far beyond the Outer Rim, areas designated in Imperial databases as the unknown regions. Before Pellaeon could note specific details, the display reverted to tactical data relevant to the immediate situation. "A personal research project, Captain," Thrawn explained, noting Pellaeon's observation. "The galaxy contains many mysteries, worthy of investigation even during times of conflict." The explanation seemed reasonable, yet Pellaeon later recognized that the coordinates displayed corresponded to no known Imperial exploration initiative. Moreover, they appeared to match fragmented reports of unusual activity that intelligence assets had flagged as low priority due to their distance from established trade routes and population centers. As Thrawn's campaign against the rebellion intensified, these private investigations continued in parallel. His meditation chamber, a space few were permitted to enter, gradually transformed into a repository of information about threats beyond Imperial knowledge. Compiled over years, tracked gravitational anomalies consistent with the movement of large objects through hyperspace, originating from regions officially designated as empty void. The serene atmosphere of this chamber belied the ominous nature of the data it contained. While Imperial lighting standards favored harsh illumination, Thrawn maintained his private spaces in soft blue light that mimicked the spectrum of his homeworld. The air held a faint scent of unfamiliar botanical elements, creating an environment conducive to the Chiss practice of extended contemplative analysis. Here, surrounded by evidence of threats the Empire refused to acknowledge, Thrawn would spend hours in perfect stillness, his mind traveling paths of possibility and prediction. The only sound came from subtle environmental controls and occasionally the gentle tone of incoming priority communications. The threats we face are not limited to those we can name, he once remarked to Eli Vanto during a rare moment of directness regarding his private research. History speaks of civilizations far older than our own, with technologies we can scarcely comprehend, who vanished leaving only fragments and warnings. We dismiss these as myths or exaggerations, yet the pattern of their disappearance suggests systematic removal rather than natural decline. The implication lingered between them, unspoken but clear. Something had caused these ancient civilizations to disappear, something patient enough to operate on time scales beyond normal strategic consideration. Something that might now have turned its attention toward the known galaxy and the civilizations that inhabited it, including both Empire and Chiss ascendancy, and, while the galaxy's major powers fought their civil war, focused entirely on immediate political concerns, this greater threat continued its quiet advance from the darkness between stars. The transmission arrived encoded in a protocol so obscure that Imperial communication systems initially classified it as background radiation. Only Thrawn's specialized algorithms running continuously on a dedicated subsystem recognized the pattern hidden within the seemingly random data fluctuations. The message itself, once decoded, contained just 5 words in ancient Chiss script. First contact confirmed. Assessments were correct. For anyone observing Thrawn at that moment, nothing in his demeanor would have revealed the significance of this communication. His expression remained impassive, his posture unchanged as he continued reviewing tactical displays on the Chimera's bridge. Yet within his calculating mind, strategies developed over decades shifted in response to this confirmation. The Grisk had arrived. Intelligence on this species remained fragmentary even in Thrawn's extensive private database. The Chiss Ascendancy had first detected their probe ships nearly 30 years earlier, monitoring their methodical exploration patterns with growing concern. Unlike conventional invaders, the Grisk operated through infiltration and manipulation rather than direct conquest. They studied target civilizations for generations, identifying pressure points in social and political structures. When they finally struck, societies typically collapsed from within, never recognizing the external influence guiding their destruction. This approach made them nearly invisible to conventional defense systems. By the time a civilization recognized the threat, its key institutions were often already compromised. The Grisk left few survivors to warn others, methodically erasing evidence of their involvement and allowing historical records to attribute the collapses to internal factors. Thrawn had first presented evidence of their approach to the Chiss defense hierarchy 15 years before his apparent exile. His recommendations had been considered too resource-intensive, too speculative, given the lack of direct confirmation. The political leadership preferred focusing on known adversaries rather than theoretical threats from beyond explored space. Their skepticism had ultimately led to Thrawn's carefully orchestrated exile and subsequent discovery by Imperial forces. If the Chiss leadership would not prepare adequately, perhaps the military resources of the Empire could be directed toward this greater threat, even without Emperor Palpatine's full understanding of their purpose. Now, with confirmation of Grisk, arrival in the fringes of known space, Thrawn's multi-decade strategy entered its critical phase. The timing could not have been worse. The rebellion had grown from isolated cells into an organized alliance with genuine military capability. Imperial resources were increasingly diverted to massive projects like the Death Star rather than the flexible defense systems Thrawn had quietly advocated. The Civil War consumed attention and assets that should have been directed toward external threats. Admiral, Captain Pellaeon interrupted these reflections, Governor Price requests your input on the deployment of ground forces on Lothal. Inform the governor that I will provide detailed recommendations within the hour, Thrawn replied, his voice betraying nothing of the calculations occurring beneath his composed exterior. Later, alone in his command quarters, Thrawn activated a secure communication protocol tied to a network separate from standard Imperial systems. This network, constructed gradually through years of careful resource allocation, connected remote sensor arrays positioned along likely Grisk approach vectors. The data confirmed his worst assessments. Their advanced elements had already established multiple infiltration points. Analysis suggested they had been studying Imperial and Alliance forces for at least 3 standard years, likely using the chaos of civil war as cover for their operations. The most disturbing evidence came from cultural analyses of worlds near these infiltration zones. Subtle shifts in artistic expression indicated the early stages of Grisk psychological influence. Historical patterns suggested these changes typically preceded direct intervention by approximately 5 standard years. The countdown had begun. Eli Vanto, recently promoted to commander, found Thrawn reviewing these findings with uncharacteristic intensity. "You've been waiting for this," Vanto observed quietly. "Preparing for it," Thrawn corrected, though adequate preparation may prove impossible given current circumstances. For the first time in their long association, Vanto detected something approaching concern in Thrawn's normally composed features. The Grisk study weaknesses. They identify precisely where pressure will cause existing social structures to fracture. With the galaxy divided between Empire and Rebellion, they have an unprecedented opportunity to accelerate those fractures. The implications hung in the recycled air of the command chamber. The civil war that dominated galactic politics was not merely a distraction from the greater threat, but potentially part of its strategy. By focusing exclusively on their ideological opponents, both Empire and Rebellion remained blind to external manipulation that might be exacerbating their conflict. "We require allies who understand the true nature of the threat," Thrawn continued. "Resources dedicated not to internal conflicts but to defense against infiltration. A unified response drawing on the strengths of multiple civilizations." The statement revealed the true scope of Thrawn's vision, an interspecies alliance transcending the political divisions of the current conflict, an approach that contradicted fundamental Imperial doctrine while simultaneously requiring Imperial military capacity. "Your service to the Empire has always been a means to this end," Vanto realized aloud. Thrawn's silence provided confirmation more definitive than any verbal response. His legendary loyalty to Imperial authority had always been conditional, subservient to the greater imperative of defending civilization itself against threats that transcended political boundaries. The revelation transformed everything Vanto had witnessed throughout their years of service. Each victory against rebel forces, each technological innovation, each carefully cultivated relationship with Imperial leadership all formed components of a strategy with objectives far beyond maintaining Imperial control. Thrawn was fighting to preserve the very foundations of civilization across the galaxy, against an enemy whose existence the Empire refused to acknowledge, using resources intended for crushing political dissent, walking a line between loyalties that could, at any moment, become fatally incompatible. When pieced together across decades, the fragments of Thrawn's true campaign reveal a strategic vision operating on multiple planes simultaneously. His earliest warnings to the Chiss ascendancy documented unusual stellar phenomena along the galactic rim, gravitational anomalies consistent with the movement of large objects through hyperspace, originating from regions designated as empty, void. These warnings included detailed analyses of archaeological findings from worlds whose civilizations had experienced sudden, unexplained collapse millennia earlier. The pattern Thrawn identified suggested not random tragedies, but systematic removal. Ancient records, dismissed by mainstream historians as mythology, described invaders who studied their prey for generations before striking. These fragmentary accounts, gathered from 100 different species with no direct contact between them, shared disturbing similarities in their descriptions of the methods and appearance of these invaders. What made these historical accounts particularly relevant was their consistency with contemporary intelligence. Remote outposts along the galactic rim reported brief contacts with vessels of unknown configuration before communications suddenly terminated. Scientific expeditions to these locations found facilities intact but completely devoid of personnel, with no evidence of conventional attack. Most significantly, cultural analyses of worlds near these incidents showed subtle but measurable shifts in artistic expression and social organization. Thrawn's specialized algorithms detected changes consistent with the early stages of psychological influence, as documented in ancient accounts of pre-collapse civilizations. These connections remained invisible to conventional imperial intelligence. Where security protocols sought evidence of rebel sabotage or criminal activity, Thrawn's private investigations identified the signature of something far more sophisticated. The patterns matched historical accounts of Grisk infiltration precisely, the first moves in a strategy that typically culminated in the complete dissolution of targeted societies. His immediate response involved positioning specialized sensor arrays beyond official Imperial patrol routes. Constructed under the guise of expanded anti-rebel surveillance, these systems were calibrated to detect the unique subspace distortions associated with Grisk vessels. The data they collected confirmed his assessment. Multiple infiltration vectors had been established with particular concentration in regions where Imperial and Rebel forces engaged in active conflict. Simultaneously, Thrawn directed resources toward technologies with specific applications against Grisk capabilities. Imperial research priorities officially focused on enhancing firepower and control systems. Yet under Thrawn's influence, significant resources were allocated to advanced sensor technologies capable of detecting the subtle biological and technological signatures of Grisk infiltrators. Shield systems received modifications designed to counter the unique energy configurations of Grisk weapons, documented in fragmentary records from previous encounters. Most controversially, Thrawn established unofficial communication channels with entities officially designated as enemies of the Empire. Through carefully vetted intermediaries, he shared sanitized intelligence regarding external threats with selected rebel commanders, whose tactical profiles suggested they might recognize the significance of his warnings. Similar communications reached Mandalorian clans, Hutt cartels, and even isolated Jedi survivors, any group with sufficient resources and independence to potentially resist Grisk influence. These initiatives occurred beneath layers of secrecy that concealed them, even from Imperial intelligence. Operational security employed CIS encryption protocols unknown to Imperial systems. Resources were diverted through complex administrative pathways that obscured their ultimate purpose. Communications traveled through networks entirely separate from standard Imperial channels. The necessity for such elaborate deception stemmed from Thrawn's recognition of a fundamental truth: the Empire's structure made it particularly vulnerable to Grisk methodology, highly centralized authority, suppression of cultural diversity, emphasis on conformity over adaptation, all characteristics that historical evidence suggested the Grisk exploited with particular effectiveness. More troubling still was the possibility that Grisk influence had already reached the highest levels of Imperial governance. Certain strategic decisions, the concentration of resources on projects like the Death Star rather than flexible defense systems, the escalation of brutality against civilian populations, The increasing emphasis on fear over effective administration aligned disturbingly well with documented Grisk tactics for weakening target civilizations before direct intervention. Faced with this possibility, Thrawn maintained a delicate balance between apparent loyalty to Imperial command and the implementation of countermeasures that contradicted official doctrine. He positioned key personnel, officers whose psychological profiles suggested resistance, to external influence in critical defensive positions. He established contingency protocols designed to maintain essential defense capabilities even if central command structures were compromised. Most importantly, he used his position to identify potential allies within both Imperial and non-Imperial power structures who might recognize the greater threat when presented with appropriate evidence. Individuals whose loyalty to civilization itself might transcend political allegiances if confronted with the reality of Grisk infiltration. This network of potential resistance formed the foundation of Thrawn's ultimate contingency, a unified response drawing on diverse cultural and military traditions, specifically designed to counter Grisk methodology, an approach that contradicted fundamental Imperial doctrine while simultaneously requiring Imperial military capacity. The extraordinary complexity of this strategy reflected Thrawn's singular vision, protection of civilization itself against threats that transcended political boundaries, regardless of the cost to his own position or reputation. Each victory against conventional enemies, each technological innovation, each carefully cultivated relationship served this greater purpose, invisible to all but his closest confidants. The convergence of perspectives on Thrawn's true purpose began not with dramatic revelation but with quiet conversations across barriers of ideology and species. Years after his apparent disappearance from known space, those who had encountered the Grand Admiral shared fragmented understandings that collectively formed a more complete picture than any individual possessed alone. Aristocrat Aralani of the Chiss Defense Fleet, speaking through secure channels with former Commander Eli Vanto, confirmed the existence of the threat Thrawn had dedicated his life to combating. The Ascendancy originally considered his assessments excessively cautious, she acknowledged, her holographic image flickering slightly across the vast distance between Chiss space and the Imperial remnant. Time has proven otherwise. The Grisk advance continues to accelerate. Their methodology remains consistent with historical patterns, though adapted to current galactic political realities. Her calm delivery belied the gravity of the information she shared. Chiss long-range reconnaissance had documented Grisk observation, posts established throughout what had once been Imperial territory. Their infiltration units had been confirmed within both New Republic and Imperial remnant power structures. Most concerning, evidence suggested they had begun the construction of infrastructure consistent with full-scale invasion rather than merely continued observation. Mithrao Nuruodo foresaw this progression decades ago, Aralani continued. His service within your empire was never a matter of ambition or exile, but a calculated deployment of a strategic asset where it might prove most effective against the greater threat. This confirmation aligned with observations Captain Gillard Pellion had compiled throughout his service under Thrawn's command. The seemingly disconnected initiatives, the unusual resource allocations, the technologies developed with specifications that exceeded conventional Imperial requirements, all formed components of preparation for conflict with an enemy the Empire refused to acknowledge. He never explicitly violated orders, Pellion explained to New Republic representatives during cautious diplomatic exchanges. Rather, he fulfilled his assigned objectives while simultaneously implementing preparations for threats beyond Imperial strategic consideration. His loyalty to civilization itself transcended political boundaries. From an entirely different perspective, Ezra Bridger offered insights gained during his unexpected journey with Thrawn following the liberation of Lothal. Their forced cooperation, initiated by circumstances neither would have chosen, had provided the young Jedi with unique understanding of the Grand Admiral's motivations. He showed me star maps Bridger recounted to Luke Skywalker during their discussions of Force-sensitive individuals who had survived the Purge. Patterns of movement stretching back thousands of years, civilizations that disappeared overnight, leaving only warnings about invaders who studied their victims before striking. The same patterns were beginning to emerge along the outer rim. These varied accounts, gathered from individuals with no reason to coordinate their testimonies, constructed a narrative that contradicted both Imperial and Rebel understanding of Thrawn's actions. Neither loyal Imperial officer nor opportunistic alien seeking power, he had instead operated as an advanced strategist against threats beyond the comprehension of those he nominally served. The wisdom gathered from these diverse sources revealed the true scope of Thrawn's vision, a multi-species alliance drawing on varied cultural perspectives and military traditions, specifically designed to counter Grisk methodology. His efforts to preserve essential elements of both Imperial and Rebel military capabilities, even as they fought one another, suddenly gained coherence when viewed through this lens. He once told me that understanding comes from studying what a people create, Eli Vanto shared during a secure briefing with representatives from both former Imperial and New Republic forces. Art reveals the soul of those who create it. The Grisk create nothing. They study, infiltrate, and dismantle. Their strategy depends on exploiting divisions between their targets, preventing unified response until resistance becomes impossible. The implication was clear. The civil war that had consumed galactic attention for decades had served Grisk purposes perfectly, diverting resources and focus from the approach of a far greater threat. Whether their influence had actively exacerbated this conflict remained speculative, but the advantage they gained from it was undeniable. Imperial doctrine favored overwhelming force applied directly, Captain Pelion observed. Admiral Thrawn recognized the inadequacy of this approach against enemies who operate through infiltration rather than conventional warfare. His preparations emphasized detection, resistance to psychological influence, and coordination between diverse defensive systems. Across these varied perspectives, a consistent truth emerged. Thrawn's legendary campaign against the rebellion had always been secondary to his preparation for conflict with the Grisk. His victories and defeats in the Civil War served primarily to position resources and personnel for the greater conflict. He anticipated even his apparent final defeat at Lothal, resulting in his disappearance along with Ezra Bridger, potentially represented a strategic repositioning rather than true elimination. He spoke of threats gathering beyond known space. That would make our political conflicts seem insignificant, Bridger recalled. At the time, I dismissed this as justification for imperial conquest. After what I witnessed during our journey through the unknown regions, I believe he may have understated the danger. The collective wisdom gathered from these diverse sources formed the foundation for what would eventually become a new approach to galactic defense, one that drew on Thrawn's strategic vision while adapting it to post-imperial political realities, an approach that recognized the necessity of unifying diverse cultural and military traditions against threats that transcended traditional boundaries. In this way, even in his absence, Thrawn's greatest campaign continued. The network of awareness and preparation he had established gradually expanded, connecting individuals who might otherwise remain divided by the lingering animosities of civil war, a network that might yet provide the foundation for civilization's defense against patient predators, moving steadily inward from the darkness between stars. The ultimate revelation of Thrawn's true purpose came not through official channels or dramatic announcements, but through the careful correlation of data fragments collected across decades and light years. In a secure facility established through the unlikely cooperation of former Imperial and New Republic intelligence assets, Specialists from diverse species assembled the pieces of a puzzle whose completion revealed a truth both vindicated Thrawn's methods and confirmed his darkest warnings. The Grysk had been actively manipulating galactic affairs for at least 70 standard years. Their initial survey vessels had entered the galaxy's outer regions during the late Republic era, drawn by the energy signatures of expanding interstellar civilizations. Unlike conventional invaders seeking immediate conquest, they had established observation posts in uninhabited systems, watching and learning with patience that spanned generations. Their methods followed patterns documented in ancient records from civilizations that had faced their attention millennia earlier. First came study, meticulous analysis of communication patterns, cultural expressions, political structures, and military capabilities. This phase typically lasted decades, with infiltration units gathering intelligence through methods so subtle that target civilizations rarely detected their presence. Next followed selective pressure, the identification and exploitation of existing social tensions. Historical records suggested the Grysk rarely created conflicts within target societies, but instead identified natural fault lines and applied precise influence to widen them. Resources flowed secretly to extremist factions. Diplomatic initiatives between potential allies mysteriously failed. Technologies that might have mitigated resource competition between rival groups developed unexpected flaws during implementation. The final phase brought direct intervention, but only after target. Societies had been sufficiently weakened through internal conflict. Grysk combat units struck precisely where defenses had been compromised by years of division, often manipulating rivals into blaming each other for these attacks. By the time targeted civilizations recognized the external threat, coordination between their fragmented components had become nearly impossible. The evidence compiled in this secure facility documented Grysk implementation of these tactics throughout recent galactic history. Small but critical failures in diplomatic relations between the Republic and separatist movements, technological sabotage that exacerbated resource competition in key sectors, psychological operations that amplified fear and extremism on all sides of emerging conflicts. Most disturbing were the indicators of Grysk influence within both Imperial and rebel leadership structures. Certain policy decisions that had escalated the Civil War beyond reasonable strategic necessity showed patterns consistent with external manipulation. The Empire's increasing brutality toward civilian populations, the rebellion's occasional targeting of infrastructure critical to basic life support rather than purely military objectives, both sides rejecting peace initiatives that might have preserved essential defensive capabilities. These revelations transformed understanding of Thrawn's service within the Empire. His efforts to preserve key defensive assets even while prosecuting the Civil War, his establishment of unofficial communication channels with nominal enemies, his emphasis on technologies specifically designed to detect and counter Grysk infiltration methods, all represented components of a strategy designed to maintain civilization's essential protective capabilities despite the political divisions being exploited by their true adversaries. The patterns in the stars that once seemed random now reveal the masterful hand of a strategist playing a game across decades, Eli Vanto observed as the assembled data told its story. Thrawn recognized what we all missed, that our greatest threat came not from our ideological opponents, but from patient predators moving steadily inward from the darkness between stars. The Imperial obsession with the Death Star suddenly gained new context, concentrating defensive resources in massive, centralized projects rather than distributed, flexible systems had left the galaxy vulnerable to precisely the type of asymmetric warfare at which the Grysk excelled. Whether this strategic error resulted from direct Grysk influence or merely exploited existing Imperial tendencies toward centralization remained speculative, but the advantage it provided to potential invaders was undeniable. Similarly, the rebellion's focus on destroying these centralized imperial assets, while justified from their perspective, had inadvertently furthered Grisk's strategic objectives by eliminating defensive capabilities that might have been repurposed against external threats. The Civil War had consumed attention and resources that should have been directed toward perimeter defenses and infiltration countermeasures. Thrawn's true mission within the Empire now became clear: to preserve and develop defensive capabilities, applicable against the Grisk while nominally serving Imperial objectives, to identify potential allies across political divisions who might recognize the greater threat when presented with appropriate evidence, to establish foundations for resistance even as the major powers weakened themselves through protracted conflict. This mission explained his careful cultivation of officers whose psychological profiles suggested resistance to external influence, his establishment of autonomous defensive outposts positioned along likely Grisk approach vectors rather than rebel infiltration routes, his development of technologies specifically designed to detect the subtle biological and technological signatures of Grisk infiltrators. Most significantly, it explained his apparent willingness to sacrifice his own position and reputation when necessary to preserve essential components of his greater strategy. His legendary status within the Empire had always been a means to an end rather than a goal in itself. When circumstances required choosing between Imperial doctrine and effective preparation against the Grisk, he consistently prioritized the latter, regardless of the personal consequences. He told me once that art reveals the soul of those who create it, Vanto recalled. The Grisk create nothing, they study, infiltrate, and dismantle. Understanding this fundamental difference wasn't merely philosophical, it identified their central vulnerability. This insight formed the core of Thrawn's counter-strategy. Against an enemy that operated through studying and exploiting existing patterns, he had worked to establish defenses based on cultural and tactical diversity, networks that connected individuals and systems with different approaches to problem-solving, technologies that drew on varied scientific traditions rather than standardized imperial protocols, communication methods that could function independently of centralized control systems. The ultimate secret of Thrawn's strategy was not merely his recognition of the Grisk threat, but his development of response mechanisms specifically designed to counter their methodical dismantling of target civilizations. A strategy that required preservation of diverse defensive capabilities even as the major powers fought to eliminate each other's assets.